That's Chris Ware about the time he visited our class, Literature for Our Time, at the University of Toronto in 2007. Chris is the one on the left. He was born in Omaha, Nebraska. His father left sometime before he was about a year old. When he was 16, he moved to San Antonio in Texas, and he worked at a Wendy's there to save money for college, but ended up spending most of it on pot and comic books, well, according to his own date book. He went to the University of Texas at Austin, again, according to date book, accepted as part of a rigorously selected freshman class of 40,000 students. His first comic strip was in a student newspaper. When he was in second year, Art Spiegelman saw the strip and liked it and called him, and that led to two stories by Chris in Raw, the magazine that first published Mouse. Ware moved to Chicago in the early 90s, and he studied at the School of Art Institute, the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where he now lives. And in Chicago, he began publishing a comic strip in a Chicago alternative weekly called The New City. That's his first strip for New City, May 21st, 1992, with God as the Superman, a figure that would show up again in Jimmy Corrigan. Jimmy first appeared in print in this strip in 1993, and Ware collected and revised the strips as stories in his comic book, his ongoing comic book, the Acme Novelty Library. That is the first number in the series, published by Fantagraphics in Seattle in 1993. Jimmy's story continued in the Acme Novelty Library over the next 8 years to number 15. The stories were then collected, revised again, and published in 2000 as the book that we're reading. He's had many other projects since then. The one that Denise showed you last week, Building Stories, that ran weekly in the New York Times Magazine from 2005 to 2006, and it was published as a book, or something like a book, the one Denise's father showed you, in 2012, a box set with a number of different items inside it. There's a comic novella called The Last Saturday that ran in the London Guardian from 2014 to 2015. It's about a young girl, a young boy in Michigan who's heavily into sci-fi. Chris also regularly does New Yorker covers. This is one of my favorites from 2014. This one's from 2018, just before the Oscars. It's a reference to the Me Too movement, called Golden Opportunity is the name of the drawing. One of Chris's recurring characters is Quimby the mouse. This is Quimby watching Jimmy dreaming about finding his son's severed head. I'm going to show you a comment left behind by a viewer on a Quimby video made for the TV show or the net show, This American Life. This is by a viewer who went at the time by the name of Jesse Dangerously. I'm going to assume a pseudonym. Yeah, the thing about Chris Ware, whom I adore, is that whenever he uses the form of humor, it isn't with the intent of provoking mirth. It almost invariably serves the end of making things hurt more. As far as I can tell, his artistic mandate is to make you hurt as much as possible, whether it's recognizing terrible things in yourself, or aching with sympathy, or drawn in by loathing, or lots of other really distressing things. I think that might actually help you, as it helped me to read and understand Jimmy Corrigan. Ware doesn't really do funny, and when he does, as Jesse says, it's to make it hurt more, not less. As I say, he visited this class in 2007. This is him getting the books. The students were getting him to sign his books, and he's shaking his head here at one student's desperate attempt to paginate Jimmy, because of course it doesn't have page numbers. She used a variety of colored Post-its to do the trick. It was probably the hardest. Chris was probably the hardest interview I have ever done for this series. He's a lovely man, very, very kind, extremely intelligent. That wasn't it. And he's extremely self-critical. His first words in the interview were an apology. He looked at the students and he said, "Look, I'm so sorry that your professor made you read this horrible book." And he told me afterwards in an email that seeing his work on the screen in the Beta Theater was like having my haircuts in high school publicly scrutinized by the girls who turned me down for prom dates. Um, his sketchbooks, this is, I wouldn't, reveal this were it not abundantly evident, this trait of Ware's in his own publications, including his published sketchbooks, which are filled with drawings and notes that berating himself for having no ideas, for drawing poorly, for not being original. The form that the loathing takes in Ware's books is usually self-loathing. He makes himself hurt. Most of his influences are, of course, comics artists, of whom he is a historian. Early newspaper cartoonists like Frank King, creator of Gasoline Alley. Those are the spines from King's collected comics, put together by Drawn and Quarterly in Montreal, designed by Chris Ware. Gasoline Alley has been running since 1918. It's the first comic strip in which the characters aged normally in real time. And you can see that in Ware's homage on the spine, Baby Skizik's aging. He started keeping a sketchbook after seeing Robert Crumb's sketchbooks while he was at the University of Texas. He said Crumb's sketchbooks rescued me from being sucked into art theory, a world of theory-based, message-laden nonsense that he was getting in school. He watched a lot of Charlie Chaplin films at the University of Texas Library. He told us he learned from Chaplin the power of communicating without words, just using gestures. One of Ware's best critics, Dan Rayburn, calls him the Samuel Beckett of comics, another writer on our course. I think in this case, more similarity than influence, and especially the shared interest in and affection for silence. Ware says himself that his main literary influence was, wait for it, his grandmother. An old story to us by now, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Eden Robinson. For Ware, it was the way she told stories, her eye for detail. In the years immediately before Jimmy, Ware was obsessed with an artist by the name of Joseph Cornell, who's a self-taught American artist, mostly known for creating small boxes filled with found objects, little worlds like this one. Ware's living room, and photographs that I've seen of it circa 1999, was kind of a shrine to Cornell. It was a Cornell box itself, filled with old toys, found items from his many collections. There's a quick visual homage to Cornell in one of the Jimmy Corrigan comics, in which Jimmy Corrigan meets Joseph Cornell. JC meets JC, one possible source for Jimmy's name. In terms of influences, it's probably important to add that Ware reads and plays music, piano. And at the time of Jimmy, he was especially into ragtime. He has often compared the experience of reading comics to playing sheet music on a piano, breathing life into the score, the comic. Here's something he wrote in his sketchbook in 1995 when he was just a couple of years into Jimmy Corrigan. It's from Goethe. Architecture is frozen music. This is, I think, the aesthetic key to the development of cartoons as an art form. One critic told Rayburn that, look, if you want to understand Ware's work, learn as much about ragtime as you can. In 2008, I had a student in the class from the Royal Conservatory of Music that year, a music student who actually played in ragtime, knew it well, much, much more than I do. And she suggested to me that the main connection between Ware's style of comics and the style of ragtime was the defining musical feature of ragtime, which is apparently its syncopation. It's unorthodox rhythms. The same way that Ware's panels don't follow as Denise showed you last week, the usual rhythms of the comics page, in particular the 3x3 panel page, the Superman in color. From the beginning of comics, newspapers printed comic strips in color to help sell the newspaper. That was the point of color. They used primary colors, especially red and blue. And that's where the superheroes of comics got their bright primary color costumes from the need to sell newspapers. Their color is a byproduct or a consequence of commercialism, of the desire to sell newspapers. In part because of that, because of its association with commerce, most alternative cartoonists abandon color. Or if they kept it, they tend to use a much more subdued, subjective palette. So the faded blue that you see in Seth's It's a Good Life If You Don't Weaken, or the cool green of Daniel Close's Ghost World. Ware began, like many alternative cartoonists, he began in black and white, ink and pencil. And when he started his strip in New City, he used whatever colors were forced on him by advertisements ganged onto his signature. That is, in corresponding pages in the magazine that were printed in color, he had to accept those colors. But with Jimmy Corrigan, Ware quite consciously made the decision to use the primary colors of superhero comics. He uses the primary colors for intensity, to focus your attention on a main character or a particular panel or an image. He will also use them to connect images across panels and pages. Watch in Jimmy Corrigan, especially for the red cardinal, the bird that flies in a superhero color between past and present in the story, between multiple generations of the Corrigans. Instead of abandoning a commercial aesthetic, superhero colors, because of its association with commerce, he reappropriated commercial colors for his own ends. It's not parody, it's sincere. The use of Superman, the use of Superman colors. I don't believe that we are meant to laugh at Jimmy's shirt. We're not meant to laugh at a grown man wearing a Superman t-shirt. It is meant to turn up the pain, to make things hurt more. That's Jimmy early in the book, flying from Chicago to a fictional town in Michigan to meet his father for the first time. Jimmy flies over Chicago, and he noticed the remains of an old family home on the edge of the city. It's what is left of his great-great-grandmother's home, though he doesn't know this. And I think that opening scene should tell us something about what the book is about, what Jimmy sees at the window of the plane, and that is the remnants of the past and the present, like the legacy of family, the stuff we push to the edges of our minds, the edges of our consciousness, but it's still there. It never goes away. It is also, I think, a good example of what I talked about last week with help from Scott McCloud, and that is how comics make you imagine what is not there, the art of the invisible. How they let the reader, set the tempo, set the duration, how long you're going to look at each panel, and therefore how long that moment takes. And it is a good example of how Ware uses recurring images to connect scenes across time. Notice the way the pillow wraps around Jimmy's head. That image shows up repeatedly. There's Jimmy imagining sitting with Peggy, Jimmy sleeping on his father's couch, and then down below, Jimmy's grandfather and great-grandfather, William, all the Corrigan men, all held by pillows. And that pillow is a way to suggest the similarities between them, right? Emotional connections across generations. It works the same way as a recurring image in poetry, like water in The Wasteland, or bees in Sylvia Plath's Ariel, arrows in Catherine Leroux's Madame Victoria. If you add them all up and consider them as a total, they might become a symbol. rather than a motif. The way Virginia Woolf's lighthouse, the recurring image of the lighthouse, accumulates symbolic meaning, something also about the need for protection, for safety, for home and shelter, something like what that pillow also suggests. Despite the subtitle, The Smartest Kid on Earth, Jimmy Corrigan is not a kid, and he is not especially smart. He is a lonely 36-year-old man who meets his father for the first and only time, James William Corrigan. His story takes place in the days leading up to Thanksgiving, which is another sign that this is a story about family, and in particular about an American family and about history. An American family with an American history. Jimmy meets more than his father for the first time. He also meets his grandfather, James Reed Corrigan. And he discovers that he has an African-American adopted half-sister, Amy Corrigan. We meet more Corrigans than Jimmy does. We see more than he does through flashbacks to his grandfather as a boy in Chicago in 1892, leading up to the World's Fair. James is also fatherless, or soon to be fatherless. His father abandons him on his birthday on the opening day of the fair. Back in the present, Jimmy's father swerves to avoid hitting a deer in a snowstorm, crashes into a peach orchard, and dies the next day in hospital. Jimmy returns to his home in Chicago alone, with his grandfather's winter boots and coat and his father's glasses and Superman sweatshirt. 5 minutes to summarize, 5 hours to read, 10 years to make. In one sense, a lifetime to make. As Ware tells you in the core agenda, Jimmy's story began for him as a way to deal with his own absent father. Ware's father, as I said, left his family when Ware was just a baby, under a year old. And he said, has said in an interview that Jimmy began as essentially an imaginary story about what I thought would happen when I met my dad. Because life is stranger than fiction, about halfway through writing Jimmy, he got a call from his father after 30 years of silence. They met just once for dinner, and Ware points out that, ironically enough, the time it takes to read Jimmy Corrigan, about 4 to 5 hours, is almost exactly the total time that he has spent with his father, either on the phone or in person. Ware's father did not know about his work, and Chris did not tell him. But he decided that when the book was published, he would give his father a copy. He didn't get the chance. His father died of a heart attack in January of 2000, about a month after Chris Ware finished the Jimmy Corrigan. There's something of the child about Chris Ware's work. It can be very adult in both senses of the word, difficulty, but also the other sense of the term, adult. Look at his sketchbooks, or if you can find it, his erotica. He told us, though, that Jimmy is set in an adult world, but it is about protecting the child that is inside of you. And he said, and I thought quite interestingly, that is actually what all cartoons are about protecting the child inside you. This is from the 10th issue of the Acme Novelty Library, one of Chris Ware's many parodies at the time of comic book ads. It is an ad for childhood. Everything you've been missing. Toys, mom, the old place, the mysteries of sex, all back and forth. Suddenly everything seems brand new. Dance around wildly, stick your butt in the air and scream, pee in the pool, read comics all day long with your hands in your pants. Tell people you saw them naked when you didn't. Stay awake at night wondering about other people's crotches while desperately hoping to get up faster. Limited time only 25 cents. It's a joke that's not a joke, right? Because that right there is pretty much exactly what Chris Ware's comics try to recreate. Childhood, everything you've been missing. It is, I think, an excellent example, that ad, of what I have been calling Byrony. Irony with a B in front of it. And that is something that appears ironic, but is actually sincere, a term that I don't know which one of us came up with it now in conversations with a friend of mine, Jeremy Keene. I think he did. Uh, it's easier to explain this term in art. This is a painting by the American lowbrow painter Mark Ryden, and it was painted around the time of David Foster Wallace's essay about the end of irony, predicting the end of irony in American fiction. This painting is called Saint Barbie in 1994. That right there is Byrony. That is a Byronic painting. And what I mean by that is that a painting that your education, your entire culture has trained you to think is ironic, must be ironic, could not be painted if it were not ironic, but is actually quite sincere. And I know it's sincere the only way that you can know such things, because as we've established, irony is not in the text, it's not in the painting. The viewer adds it. The way I know that this is sincere is not from the text then, but from its environment, and that is what I know about Mark Ryden and the school of painting, lowbrow painting, to which he belongs. But I assure you, it is not ironic. This is a counterexample. This is a 1964 ad, a parody ad, an advertisement from Mad Magazine. Pretty much the epitome. This is textbook postmodernism. That is ironic. That is it's a portrait, by the way, of Frank Frazetta. He was a well-known portraitist or illustrator for fantasy novel covers, and that's his portrait of one of the Beatles, Ringo Starr, on the back cover of the October 1964 issue of Mad Magazine. That is postmodernism. That is ironic. Ware's ad just looks ironic because Mad Magazine taught us to see his ad as ironic, but it's not. It's sincere. It's about what his comics are about, which is the attempt to recreate the world of a child. It's a very good example of how the point of Ware's humor is to make things hurt more. That old guy in the wheelchair there, remembering his childhood, that is not funny. That is sad. Ware doesn't want his comics to tell you what a child's world is like. He doesn't even really want his comics to show you what a child's world is like. What I think he's after is something harder still, and that is to get you to feel what it feels like to be a child again through Jimmy. For example, this is the first scene, Jimmy and his mom on the way to the classic car show, where he will meet the Superman actor. Now, in comics, dialogue usually appears in bubbles, like Jimmy's speech. So why don't his mother's or the Superman's actors' words appear in bubbles? Why is her dialogue above or below the panels in the space that is normally reserved in comics by convention for the narrator? Because to a child, adult speech comes from outside the panel, outside their world. Because to a child, adult voices are like a narrator, omniscient gods. Childhood is a world of imagination, like the text, something with a narrator. But because of that, it is also a tremendously lonely world, maybe the loneliest we will be all our lives. And it's one of the great blessings of the species that we simply can't remember how lonely we were then. Ware's first comic book was actually called Lonely. Full stop. It's pretty simple. Lonely Comics and Stories, Chicago, 1992, photocopied and sold on consignment. That's going to be the most there, with Nancy on the left and Popeye just barely on the right. Another example, there's Jimmy as an adult trying to answer the letter from the father he's never met. Instead of telling us how Jimmy is feeling in a thought balloon or narrative text above the panel, Ware helps us feel it by drawing Jimmy as a small child holding a giant pencil, somebody who feels outsized by the objects of his world, diminished by them. The book is told by a third-person narrator, the voice that says but, and, later, and who occasionally comes out and speaks to us directly, for example, in the cutout pages or the core agenda or the introduction. But visually, it often adopts the viewpoint of the character. Not Jimmy feels small, third-person narration. I feel small. It's a focalization, first-person focalization in comics, the way comics can do it. The world of the child pervades Jimmy. It's there in the primary colors, the bold, playful fonts, the playing around with space, with blocks, playing with blocks, for God's sakes. It's there in the sense of reading as play, of a book as a physical object, as a toy, the cutouts that you can literally make from some of the pages in this book, cutouts like these. These ones were put together by a student in this class, Juliana Johnson. There's many more of them. You can find most of them, I think, or all of them online at Acme Novelty Archive.org, where another fan has put them all together for you. Or things like this. This is about 2 feet tall. It's a book dispenser that Ware made. You drop a key in the slot and you get a tiny 60-page Jimmy comic that is unavailable anywhere else. That there's only one copy of it, and it's in his living room. I think it's the first version of the island story that I told you about last week. That sense of reading as play is also in the comics themselves, most overtly in what are called the map strips. So I'll show you an example. So we're looking through Jimmy's window at home in his apartment in Chicago, and Ware's telling us which panel to go to next. This is one of the ways he does it. With, you can see the color here, right? The brown for the window frame that tells us where to go next and follow the pattern. If you follow that, you come down here and you're in Jimmy's apartment, where this was located in the present. This is the past here. We know this is in the present because it's connected to Jimmy. His color is there. Beside his chair there, that's Jimmy's night table or side table. Then you follow the color and we open it and we take out the drawer that's inside it, and we open the drawer, and inside it there's a photograph and a frame, and you take the photograph out of the frame. And you discover that there's a picture in there, torn in half, of Jimmy's parents, Jimmy and his parents. The part that's still there in the drawer is the part with his mom, right? The torn apart part, presumably torn apart around the time they separated, it's over here, it's in the dump. And then down below, what we get is a time frame of their lives. So this is in the present down here. And this is one of the ways, by the way, that this is how we know that Jimmy's father is not going to survive this story, because this way is the future, right? And there's Jimmy's father. This way is the past. There's Jimmy's grandfather. And over here, this panel here, this one leads us via its color palette and its illustration into the past. If you turn the page, you will go into the past, where we will see his great-grandfather installing Jimmy's window, that window. That's 1708 Peachwood Avenue. Jimmy doesn't know it, but his ancestors made his window on the world. He sees the present through the past, almost literally. What we just did is closer to play than it is to reading, right? The joy of a puzzle, figuring it out, animating the page for yourself. Remember Scott McCloud, there's no life here except that which you make. Making that page come to life requires the reader's active attention and imagination. Jimmy Corrigan uses a different style than most of Ware's earlier comic books, most of which were in black and white. The obvious difference is the addition of color, but the pacing is also quite different. The panels are less crowded, and the pacing is substantially slower. Ware has said that the cartoonist who showed him the possibilities of a slower pace was a Canadian, the Canadian Chester Brown. The gentle roll of what he calls the gentle roll of Chester's autobiographical comics in particular. Here's an example of what I think he's talking about, the sort of thing I think he's talking about. This is from Brown's 1994 book, I Never Liked You. And it's Chester making a muscle with the extra panel stretching out the embarrassment of the scene, making her wow just a little bit more sarcastic. You can see this pacing in Jimmy's scenes with his father, the same use of silent panels to help recreate the awkwardness of their meeting, the painful silences of their meeting. Besides the emotional realism of this book, Ware's book is, as you will have noticed, realistic in other ways. I mean, he spent many, many hours researching the Chicago's World Fair so he would get it right. It's not just his buildings, it's the sketchbooks, where sketchbooks have notes about the workmen's clothes, their accommodations, their wages. Remember the index card I showed you from Vladimir Nabokov's archives about Lolita's height and weight, the same kind of careful attention to real world, to facts, but all in the service of the imagination. Like Nabokov, I think that Ware is ultimately less interested in documenting the world than in creating an imaginary world, that state of aesthetic bliss that Nabokov says in the afterword to Lolita is the only job that art has. You can see, I think, that attraction in Ware to storytelling, to the worlds we left behind in childhood, their shared attraction to metaphor, to coincidence, to symbol. In Nabokov, fairy tales, castles, classical mythology, the number 342. In Chris Ware, dead horses in a bed, giant grasshoppers. Jimmy's robot suit, his crutch, peaches, deer, the color red. In Lolita, fairy tales gave Nabokov the bedrock of his imaginary world, right? And something, ironically enough, a solid fictional foundation upon which to put the real. In Jimmy Corrigan, the bedrock is comics, the history of comics. And in the same way, I think, exactly, and that is sincerely and ironically at the same time, I think that what Ware is doing in Jimmy Corrigan is taking the implicit metaphors of comics, metaphors that were always implicit in comics, were always implicitly there, and exaggerating them up to the breaking point of irony, which is the fine line between irony and sincerity. The point where irony tips over is sincerity, becomes Byrony. Most obviously, sorry, that was a little abstract, most obviously the metaphor of Superman. Superman shows up first as an actor at a car show. Remember, he sleeps with Jimmy's mom and he sneaks off in the morning, leaving Jimmy his mask. Then the adult Jimmy sees the Superman jump to his death from a building across the street from his office. And as a newspaper headline tells us 15 pages later, this Superman is definitely not the television actor. He's also not Superman. I showed my son this picture when I first read this book, and because he's into Superman, he's into comics. I thought, wow, like I'm finally doing something that David will be interested in. And I showed him this picture, and he said, that's not Superman. And Superman doesn't wear gloves, and he doesn't have a yellow cape. And then he left. Dan Rayburn suggests that after the Superman suicides, Jimmy emerges at the end of this book, or through this book, as a real Superman, as an everyday hero. And that's kind of Rayburn's reading of Jimmy Corrigan, that it's about the creation of an everyday hero. I don't think that's quite right myself. I can see it, but I don't think it's quite right, because Jimmy doesn't seem especially heroic to me now or at the end of the book, or in the future for that matter. The Superman in Jimmy Corrigan is not a superhero. He is the metaphor of a superhero made explicit. And what I mean by that is he's not Superman, he's the Superman. He's a metaphor. He's a metaphor for God, for fathers, which is what God is a metaphor for. The real Superman was always a metaphor, right? Always a replacement God for modern mass culture. All superheroes are replacement gods for modern culture. They're all metaphors for God, for the God that we left. So we had to find new ones. Ware picks up, I think, on what was always implicit in superheroes, always promised in superheroes, and that is their godlike power, but also their moral ambiguity. The sense that at any time, and we don't know it, they might use this incredible power that they have, this super power, this omniscient power that they have, to hurt us. And that concern becomes explicit in Ware's sketchbooks. This is one of his, from his date book. This is early 1992. In the first panel, God sends a thunderbolt to Earth. Well, says God, I certainly hope that teaches those stupid poor people a lesson. Nothing like a good natural disaster to set someone straight. I was getting so sick of their pouting anyway. Hello, what's this? Well, it's some children selling candy to benefit their church group. Now that's the sort of thing that I know for a fact that those little bastards won't send me a dime of that money. And after the fire, says the narrator, let's see them try to rebuild that church stricken with typhoid. Ha ha. There's another page in the sketchbook where God shoots Jimmy in the left foot, by the way, and then he laughs at Jimmy's pain. And presumably that is how Jimmy hurt his foot. That is why Jimmy always walks with a crutch, a cause that Ware left out of the book. Never made it into the book itself, but was there in the comics. Here's the published version of that draft. This is in New City, May 21st, 1992. This version, because it was for people, readers, real people, and an editor, he softened it a bit. So he took out the typhoid joke and he added new panels in which God sees a man weeping and thinks, I wonder if he needs help, and takes off to the rescue. This God, the one that made it into print, he's not so much a malevolent God as a God who is both merciful and cruel. He's closer to fate than God. This is another of Ware's joke ads that is not a joke that is not a joke. I think it would be wrong to read Ware's Superman as a critique of God or of religion. I don't think that's his interest. I think, for starters, that argument is far too old to be of any interest to him. It is more that Superman is part of the imaginary world of this book, which is a child's world in which much more powerful forces are in control. Forces that you as a child cannot understand, like God, like the Superman, like parents, God the Father. This is from Ware's sketchbooks. And again, this is a draft, in this case, of a cover, late 1994. When he visits his father for the first and only time, Jimmy gets hit by a mail truck, a physical echo of the psychological blow of the letter he got through the mail from his father, right? When he looks up after getting hit by the letter from his father, the mail truck, he sees the driver as the Superman. God is the Superman as his father. They overlap in his mind as they overlap in the mind of our culture. Jimmy Corrigan's initials are JC. If the Superman is God, does that make Jimmy his abandoned son? Jesus Christ. JC. Worth pointing out here that Jerry Siegel, who's the co-creator of the original Superman comic, also did a crime comic with a hero in it called Detective Jim Corrigan. JC and another Corrigan, no doubt another source of the name. And JC, of course, as I hinted before, also shares initials with Joseph Cornell, an artist very influential upon Ware for this book. This is the first appearance of the bird that appears throughout the book. The bird's function and color suggest an association with the Superman, right? Perhaps as his natural agent or avatar. What I mean by that is they're both red and they both fly. I wasn't sure about this until I saw something that most of you cannot have seen, and that is an image that is hidden under the fold of the cover on the hardcover edition. You're reading the paperback edition. You'd have to have the hardcover edition with the original paper cover, and you would have to take the cover off and unfold it and look inside it. It's something you wouldn't see it unless you took the cover off, and if you did that, you would see this. Or much more than this, actually. This is a tiny little section of it that I've blown up for you. On the left, Jimmy imagining different faces for his father, what his father might look like, because he hasn't met him yet. And then below him, the red bird, a plane, the Superman. Now, read it. Read the text visually. Look up in the sky. It's a bird. It's a plane. It's Superman. So if the bird is working for Superman, then he's been watching over Jimmy from the beginning and still is. His final appearance, the bird's final appearance of the book, is to sing for Jimmy while his father lies dying in the hospital. And I am honestly not sure if that is supposed to be comforting or not. Comforting or disturbing. Jimmy Corrigan is about the lasting effects of the past, and in particular, the lasting effects of family, how you cannot escape family. And again, Ware helpfully points this out in case we failed to notice it. In his summary of our story thus far, he includes among the things to remember, Jimmy wears old-fashioned pants, right? The presence of the past in the present, right down to his pants. He draws both Jimmy and his grandfather as a boy with the faces and postures of old men, the visible legacy of the past in the present. Jimmy's father rejects the effects of a bad childhood. He says, look, how you were treated as a child has nothing to do with how you are as an adult. He says, my father never even had a mother, and I turned out just fine, right? The story proves him wrong. His father is not fine. None of the Corrigan men are fine. You remember I've been saying that a number of different lectures now that literature is not a book. Literature is not the book. Literature is the product of the reader and the book, the same as it is for comics. One consequence of that, one that I've already mentioned, is that books change for every reader. They're never the same for each reader. But the other consequence, and another consequence, is that books change over time. That the novel you read in 2010 will not be the same novel if you read it now in 2020, because you have changed, because the world has changed. I mean, just try reading, let's say John Mandel's Station 11 now, for example, with COVID-19 going around. Believe me, it's not the same novel as it was when I first read it, or Daniel Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year. Anyway, I haven't read Jimmy since 2014, 5 years ago. And to me, to read it now is to rereading it now for you, is to see it much more now than I did then as a novel about what we've been calling toxic masculinity. This is something that Denise hinted at or gestured to in her excellent talk on the book. All the bad male role models in this book, all the bad lessons that men in this book pass on to their sons, and lessons about women in particular. As I say, that's not the book that I saw the first time I read it, but the world has changed me, and therefore it has changed, my reading of the book. I'm seeing things in it differently, things that Ware always put there and I just didn't see. Anyway. The book's also about the lasting effects of the past in another way, I would say, and that is the past of America. This one's maybe a bit more obvious. Slavery. Jimmy's great-grandfather, William Corrigan, impregnated their black servant, May. And that illegitimate child is Amy Corrigan's great-grandmother. So the effect of the great-grandfather's abandonment of his son is suggested partly by their shared name, right? They're all called Jimmy. That legacy of abuse and pain and abandonment passed on down through the generations, all the Jimmys. But instead of James to James, James to Jimmy, what we get in Amy's family tree is May to Amy, a heritage that has been jumbled by slavery, that has been broken. The word has been broken, twisted, turned around. The way Lisa Marie's heritage was broken by residential school, her family history, in Eden Robinson's Monkey Beach. But either way, broken or not, James to James or May to Amy, the past leaks into the present. It might be true that you can't go home again. It is also true that you can never leave it because it never leaves you. So another sad book. I'm sorry, I never promised you a rose card. For what it's worth, I read the ending of Jimmy's story hopefully. I read in it the promise of a relationship for Jimmy, a new start. The ending is ambiguous, to say the least. He considers suicide, but after he meets a woman at work, Tammy, and the story hints that they are about to go out for their own Thanksgiving dinner, that they are about to start their own American family, and maybe this family will be just a little different. But I don't know how to read the next page, the last page. This is the Superman carrying Jimmy away. He's waving, right? He looks hopeful. But I can't forget what Superman has done before to Jimmy, his capacity for cruelty. A student suggested that the Superman in this final image is taking Jimmy the child away, Jimmy the dreamer, and leaving the adult Jimmy behind in the real world. Brian McLaughlin, who's the cartoonist who took this class some years ago, he's the one who did the Waiting for Godot video game that I showed you. He argued in his essay for this class that the ending of Jimmy Corrigan is about comics, that it's about a reconciliation between superhero and alternative comics, father and son, in which the superhero comics are the father and the independent alternative comics, the present that I showed you last week, are the son. Your edition, by the way, has a second epilogue, Amy working in an old folks' home on Thanksgiving, which is not in the first edition. It doesn't add much to the story in terms of helping us know how it ends. In his sketchbook, Ware writes, let the reader finish the story. And you might remember that is pretty much exactly what Virginia Woolf wrote in her diary about her method into the lighthouse. The reader must sort it out. Chris Ware's comics echo the way we actually experience the world, which is not just through our minds, rationally, it is also emotionally. Moving quickly between the past and the present, between memories and daydreams. And that is why I think Ware's comics are compelling and in one sense very accessible, because they follow the paths of consciousness. I think that's also why they're hard to read, because consciousness is complex. I tried to set you up for this last September with Virginia Woolf, right? Just as accessible and just as hard, and for much the same reason. If you like, To the Lighthouse was training for Jimmy Corrigan. So here endeth your last Sermon from the Mount in digital format this time, which I very much regret, as I'm sure do you. None of us wanted it to end quite this way, but it has. I'd like to thank the authors who came to visit us, John McGregor, Sarah Peters, Catherine LaRue, some of them really, some of them virtually. Sean McPhail, I'm in your debt, Sean, for keeping us all organized, and for your research and your lecture in particular on Madame Victoria. Your TAs for taking the time from the research to help us out. Dustin, Nicole, Julia, Megan, Carl, Stefan, Tim, Alusha, Kathleen, Pratna, Denise, and Christina. Thank you very much for all that you have done and will do in the time we have left. Most of all, and this feels very weird to be saying this into a camera as opposed to, you. Thank you for your curiosity, for your courtesy, and for your sincerity. I am glad that we had this chance, no matter how abbreviated it was. And I'm still here. Send me an email, we'll talk. Have a good life. Take care of yourself.